Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast and video, Through the Bible in 10 plus years. Well, those of you who've watched this for a while won't be surprised that I've decided to take another diversion. I haven't forgotten 1 Corinthians. I always come back eventually and finish these things. But I was thinking about the question, what is Wesleyan holiness? For various reasons. And I spun out an outline that I really liked. It's a 5-part outline, and I thought, why don't I go ahead and use the next 5 weeks as a way of writing a little booklet, something like a brief guide to Wesleyan holiness, and then self-publish it. Why not? So in my outline, the first section, is titled Sin in Action. And the purpose of this section is to ask the question, well, what is sin? What are we talking about here? And between this week and, Lord willing, next week, we can see that sin is more than one thing, as it were. It's not just one definition fits all. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give away the end, spoiler alert, that I would say that there are two basic entries in my sense of the New Testament's definition of sin. One is that sin is to do wrong, and we find a verse in 1 John, I believe it's chapter 5, that says sin is wrongdoing. And so there you have it. Sin is wrongdoing. Sin is doing wrong. And then the other one is sin is to wrong somebody. You can sin against God. You can sin against your neighbor. So two basic definitions. One is to do wrong, and the second is to wrong somebody. And that's basically where I'm going to end up. Well, but let's step back a second, because you probably heard some stuff that I think isn't very helpful. So, for example, you may at some point have heard someone say, sin is to miss the mark. And they might even say, in the Greek, sin is to miss the mark. Well, I believe this definition misses the mark. I'm not even entirely sure where this idea comes from, that sin is missing the mark. I think maybe in some tragic Greek tragic poet that is, maybe someone shoots an arrow and it errs or it wanders or it misses its target, it misses the mark. Maybe Aeschylus has a reference like that. I don't remember exactly where. Well, this is a horrible basis for the meaning of a word. For one thing, take Aeschylus lived 400 years before Christ. So that would be like saying that the way that they were using English in King James Day, in England, is the Bible on what a word means today. I mean, words, new meanings come up just even last week, a meaning can pop up, because the meanings of words are really how we're using the words. And so it doesn't really matter how a word was being used 400 years ago in terms of how it's using today. There might be a relationship, there might not be a relationship. In fact, there's a word for it. It's called the etymological fallacy. It's the sense that, because the history of the word, it meant this, therefore it must mean that today. That's a fallacy. The meaning of words is a function of how they're being used. And this is a popularity contest. Your dictionary lists them, and the number one way that a word is being used is, number one, you can have archaic meanings that eventually they stop even putting in the dictionary because nobody's using that anymore. There are new meanings that pop into the dictionary. Dictionaries have to be updated. You have the 2023 Webster's Dictionary and so forth. So to say that because in some obscure reference in a Greek poet, it meant the error, actually, that's not even what it meant. It means to err or to wander. It's just in that particular instance, it was an arrow that was wandering. And you can see that there's all kinds of fallacies in that whole idea. Why does it stick? I don't know, because it's memorable. Things stick when they're memorable. Not because things don't stick because they're right. Things stick because they're memorable. And so really, let's go with 1 John, where it says that sin is doing wrong. Now, of course, that does beg the question of what wrong is. What does it mean to do wrong? More on that in a second. Now, you can wrong somebody else. Let's say you forget your anniversary. You have sinned against your spouse. Now, you can see that particular example is not intended. So there is such a thing as unintentional sin, And we do find that in the Old Testament, especially. The sin, when you talk about the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament, this one day a year when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies to atone for the sins of the people committed in ignorance, there, I've said it. The primary atonement on the Day of Atonement was not for intentional sin. In fact, most of the time in the Old Testament, intentional sin, it causes immediate and irrevocable separation from your Israel and often your life. Achan didn't get a chance to, well, if I ask forgiveness, can I get out of being stoned? The sin system in the Old Testament is primarily oriented around intentional wrongdoing. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It's oriented. The Old Testament sacrificial system is oriented around unintentional wrongdoing. Intentional wrongdoing just caused death, stoning, immediate exile from Israel, ostracism. These sorts of things. But there is sins committed in ignorance in the Old Testament, and there's also what we might call corporate sins, the sins of Israel as a group. So it's sins committed in ignorance, unintentional, and it's the sins of the group of Israel. Now, here's what I want to say. That is not at all the primary reference of sin in the New Testament. Now, the New Testament doesn't throw that away. I'm not suggesting we throw that away. I'm simply saying that as John Wesley, indicated, that sin properly so called, at least in the New Testament, the focus is on, Wesley said, a willful transgression against a known will of God. That is to say, that the sin with which the New Testament is overwhelmingly concerned is not accidental sin, but intentional wrongdoing. James 4:17 gives an example of this, where it says, if someone knows to do good and they don't do it, you've got sin. That's called a sin of omission, whether you should do something and you don't do it. A sin of commission is where you shouldn't do something and you do it. So, but in both cases, both sins of omission and sins of commission, in the way that I'm talking about it here, and the way James is talking about it, it's intentional. You know, and you do the wrong thing. That is the kind of sin with which the New Testament is overwhelmingly concerned when it comes to what we call sin acts, or acts of sin, actions of sin. Now, some of you might be saying, well, I know Matthew 5. Jesus says, whoever looks on a woman has already committed adultery in their heart, or whoever hates their brother has already killed them, murdered them in their heart, and they didn't do anything. Well, I would say these are also sin acts. They're mental acts. In fact, the physical act of doing wrong is really secondary to what the most important sense of doing a sin is, and that is the mental act. There's a limbo there. James 1 talks about it, where it is when desire has conceived that it gives birth to sin. So there's some sort of a fuzzy barrier between I'm being tempted, I'm being tempted, I'm being tempted. I have conceived a sin. You've got sin. And what makes that happen? It is a intentionality. It is an act of choice that switches between temptation to, my grandfather used to say the old saying, you can't keep a bird from flying over your head, but you can keep it from making a nest in your hair. It's when you let the bird make a nest in your hair that sin is conceived. And what is the barrier there? What is the boundary that is? It's when intentionality comes to bear on it. So temptation, intentionality, sin. So yes, Jesus says in Matthew 5 that you can look on a woman and sin in your heart. But that's not just being tempted by a woman or being tempted by someone who's not your spouse. Being tempted is not the sin. It is the act. And I don't know how to parse that. Well, Ken, when exactly does that happen? When does it go from a temptation to being an actual sin? And I'll say, well, that's not my problem. That's God's problem. God knows all things. God knows. And so I don't have to know. I can't know those sorts of things. That's up to God. But my point is that the point of sin that Jesus is concerned with, the point of sin that the New Testament concerned with is a time of choice, as it were. Now, choices can be made subtly. Choices can be made subconsciously. It's not always I sit down and I say, do I choose A, ding, or do I choose B, ding? I choose A. It's not always quite so conscious as that. In fact, John Wesley, talked about sins of surprise. I always thought that was a funny way to call it, where you all of a sudden explode at somebody. You get angry. You didn't intend to, you didn't sit down and, should I explode at this person? Should I not explode at this person? But there was some sort of a process going on internally. Wesley talks about, maybe you didn't get enough sleep, maybe you didn't get enough food, to where if you back up, there was a choice before that moment happened. I'm not interested in parsing those things out because that's God's business. What I'm simply making the claim is that in the New Testament, the overwhelming priority of what is considered sin in the New Testament is sin that is intentional. And I'm talking about a mental intention that precedes a physical act, or maybe the physical act doesn't happen, but there is a mental choice that is made in which desire conceives and gives birth to sin. That is the kind of sin that the New Testament is overwhelmingly concerned with. So sin is doing wrong, and sin is wronging others. Now, when you wronging others, there's a lot of unintentional sin in that bucket, in the sin of wronging others because you've unintentionally done it. Of course, I think, again, when the New Testament talks about wronging others, it primarily has in mind I intentionally wronged someone else. Okay, I feel like I've maybe made things sound complicated, so let me, beep, beep, beep. Let me go back. Sin is doing wrong, and sin is wronging others. That's a sin act, acts of sin. Now, you might say, well, how do I know what wrong is? You said it involves intentionality, but what kind of intentionality? I mentioned Wesley's definition of a willful transgression against a known law of God. I think we can, first of all, I want to clarify this idea, this misconception that sin is about anything short of absolute perfection. I do not think that is at all what the New Testament indicates. In fact, now in general, I like the New Living Translation, but I believe it completely misleads with regard to Romans 3:23. The New Living Translation translates Romans 3:23 as, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious standard, as if falling short of the glory of God means falling short of absolute perfection, or something along that. I actually think a better translation of Romans 3:23 would be, all have sinned and are lacking the glory of God. And there's a whole theology of glory in Paul and Hebrews and so forth that I think stands behind that. James Dunn, in his Romans commentary, first kind of blew my mind on this. But basically, if you go to Psalm 8, it says, what is humanity? That you are mindful of them, that you visit them, you crown them with glory and honor in the creation, Psalm 8 says. But Hebrews, quoting this, says, but we don't see that. That was what humanity was intended to have, but humanity does not have the glory that God intended them to have. In fact, Hebrews 2 goes on to say that Christ is leading many of God's children to glory. And so, and also Romans talks about the glory of God a little bit, the glory that is to come, and our glorification and so forth. And so what we are lacking is not meeting the standard, missing the mark. That's not what Romans 3:23 it's saying, is that because of human sin, we do not have the glory that God intended humanity to have. That's what Jesus has come to solve, to lead us to obtain that glory. So Romans 3:23 is not saying all have sinned and have fallen short of God's absolute perfection, and therefore you must go to hell. That's not what Romans 3:23 is about. And there are other verses that I think are similarly misinterpreted in the New Testament. Perhaps maybe we'll get into some of them in this 5 video and podcast sequence. So it's not absolute perfection. What is it that God expects? Well, Romans 14, I think it's 23, says, whatever is not of faith is sin. What's the context? Romans 14 is about when you're not sure whether something's right or wrong, or rather when people disagree over what's right and wrong. Say, take the Sabbath. One person considers all days the same. Another person thinks you should observe the Jewish Sabbath. Paul says, let each be fully convinced in their own mind. One person thinks they shouldn't eat any meat for fear that they'll eat meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. Another person says it's all God's anyway. Let each be fully convinced in their own mind. So what Paul says is whenever you act not from faith, that is sin. And so two people can do the very same action. One eats that meat, one doesn't eat that, or two people eat that meat. Let's say that. One of them sins and the other doesn't, because the one thinks that it's wrong to eat the meat, but they do it, and the other thinks it's not wrong to eat the meat, and they do it. The one who acted not from faith has sinned. The one who acted from faith has not sinned. Now, I'm not saying that that applies to murder, but on disputable issues, it does, according to Paul. And he's inspired. So whatever's not of faith is sin. So it goes back to Wesley's definition. It goes back to the definition or the description in James 4:17. If you know you shouldn't do something and you do it, that's sin. Or if you know you should do something and you don't do it, that's sin. We can even step back one further from faith and say that when Jesus summarizes the law in Matthew 22, Paul does it in Romans 13 and Galatians 3, he basically says the whole law can be summed up in terms of love. So anybody who does an action that is contrary to love, you might say, is, as it were, sinning. Again, that gets into the fuzziness about, well, don't we do that all the time? All I want to say is that the New Testament treats sin as something that we can, by the power of the Holy Spirit, have power over it. Let me anticipate 2 weeks from now. 1 Corinthians 10:13. There's no temptation that's gotten the best of you, but such is common to humanity. God is faithful. He will make a way for you to be able to bear it, that you can escape that temptation. So in general, the New Testament, the default position of the New Testament is that a person with the Holy Spirit need not lose to temptation. Well, that's 2 weeks from now. This week, the question is, what about acts of sin? And we've said that acts of sin are sin where you do wrong, which is you act against something you know you should do or shouldn't do, or when you wrong someone else, which is you do something that is contrary to love of your neighbor, for example. Sin acts, to do wrong and to wrong someone. This has been, through the Bible in 10 plus years, what is sin?